You know, a reputation isn't built overnight, and if you consider Honda to be not just a household name, but a good one, they largely have cars like this one to thank. With 4 cylinders, 4 doors, and 4 lugs per wheel, this 1984 LX sedan represents the second generation Honda Accord, which ran from 1982 to 1985. Packaging fine, robust hardware into a user-friendly design with clean, square, minimal styling, coveted by the masses and respected by enthusiasts, this car may have been to the early 80s what the iPhone was to 2008. In a sea of truly lackluster competitors from the domestic brands Americans were used to, these Hondas were different, new, refreshing, well-built and well-branded, cool, but seemingly not for the sake of being so, and truly desirable, with demand outstripping supply such that long waiting lists and outrageous dealer markups were the norm. Now currently in its 10th generation, one thing that's been consistent since the Accord first went on sale in 1976 is that each coming revision caters to the North American market a little more directly than the last. So this Accord appeased Americans not only by growing somewhat larger and more powerful, it made history in 1982 by becoming the first car from a Japanese nameplate to be assembled in the United States. Honda's brand new Marysville, Ohio assembly plant was built both to appease American shoppers wary of supporting a foreign economy and to avoid new federal regulations targeting imported cars. You'll notice, however, that this particular car sports a VIN number beginning in J, indicating that it was in fact built in Japan. Indeed, even after Honda started building Accords in Ohio, some U.S. domestic market Accords were still imported from Japan, and the inverse was true as well, with Honda reverse importing some of its U.S.-built cars back to its home country. With Accords hailing from both places of origin simultaneously, it was possible to compare Japanese and American-built cars side by side, which many critics did, concluding that the assembly quality of the American models was equal to those built in Japan. This newfound revelation proved that the fine craftsmanship Japanese cars were quickly becoming known for was intrinsic to company practices and not the country of origin itself. Another point of consistency for the Accord has been its placement on Car and Driver magazine's 10 Best list, which it's now appeared on a record 34 times. This pattern began in 1983 when the 10 Best list was born, and the second generation Accord made the rank every chance it got, 3 years in a row. This car has spent its entire life in eastern Tennessee and the western Carolinas, and displays just 104,000 miles on its still working 6-digit odometer. But while this unit is straight, complete, and rust-free with low mileage, it hasn't spent the past 35 years being treated like a museum piece. Current defects are mostly limited to a significant power steering leak, a fourth gear that won't engage, a rough idle, and a freon leak. So it's not perfect, but hey, in 1984, some American cars practically came off the assembly line in that kind of shape. The Accord's simple elegance begins with its exterior styling. It's dated now, but it's a simple, squared-off design that trades extravagance for attention to detail. The boxy shape places function over form, but the car is proportioned and finished well enough to come off as slick rather than dorky. The hood sits very low for good aerodynamics, with the trunk lit up a little higher to maximize cargo space. The car's body is held up well, thanks to its fit and finish, which were so good as to be considered a marvel at the time. This particular car is a white-on-blue LX sedan. Consistent with Honda's Keep It Simple philosophy, this car was available in just a few basic configurations. You essentially chose sedan or hatchback, manual or automatic, and base model or LX. There weren't many standalone factory options, really just the air conditioning and radio, and even then only on lower level cars. For this LX sedan, AC and the 4-speaker AM/FM cassette stereo were standard. Other spoils of the LX trim included power windows, locks, and antenna, these Audi-esque plastic hubcaps, and the quartz digital clock, which, to show you just how old this car really is, was kind of a big deal. Another relic of the mid-80s, the number of interior colors this car came with. Blue, red, tan, gray, black, light gray, dark red, and dark blue. But to streamline things, each exterior color was paired to just one interior color, and no more than 4 exterior color choices were offered for each permutation of body style and trim level. For instance, an LX sedan could only be white on blue, gray on light gray, red on dark red, or blue on dark blue. Standard equipment on the Accord was pretty basic by modern standards, but it included a rear defroster, tinted glass, a tachometer, power brakes, and on all but base model manual transmission hatchbacks, power steering. There was only one engine option for all 1984 Honda Accords, and there's nothing wrong with that because it's a good one. This single overhead cam 1.8 liter 4-cylinder is good for a whopping 86 horsepower. This engine was all new for 1984, although fuel injection didn't arrive until 1985. This 1984 car makes do with a 3-barrel carburetor and Honda's proprietary CVCC technology. CVCC was a type of stratified charge system, meaning in this case that the cylinder head had 2 intake valves, one closer to the spark plug than the other, and the air-fuel richness of the mixture routed to each of those 2 valves was different. This was made possible by use of an ignition prechamber. Additionally, the timing of the 2 valves was staggered. This allowed for a cleaner, more thorough fuel burn, and this technology was originally developed by Honda in order to allow its gasoline-carbureted engines to meet tightening government emission standards without using a heavy, expensive catalytic converter. And while by the time this car came out, emission standards had progressed to the point where a catalytic converter had become necessary, CVCC's advantages were still relevant. Transmissions were 5-speed manual or this optional 4-speed automatic. It's noteworthy that the Accord, despite being an affordable, compact car, offered 5 speeds in its manual and 4 in its automatic as standard, in a day when 4-speed manuals and 3-speed automatics were the norm. Of course, the overdrive 4th gear is missing now in this car, but I suppose that just puts it on par with a lot of other cars from this day, which offered a 1-to-1 ratio as their highest gear right out of the gate. Granted, this car probably would have come with a different final drive ratio if it hadn't come with overdrive from the factory. This transmission also comes with a lock-up torque converter to improve fuel economy and drivability at higher speeds. Suspension was 4-wheel independent with McPherson struts all around and a sway bar for the front. A rear sway bar came on hatchbacks only. Here again we see the Accord mechanically outclassing the competition, as many mainstream cars of this day were a long ways off from gaining independent rear suspension. But thanks to good packaging, the Accord's IRS setup doesn't leave it with a cramped trunk. At 13.3 cubic feet of space, it's pretty big for a little car like this, and it's well finished with a flat floor and a very usable shape. The back seat, however, is where the Accord's modest dimensions are most evident. Despite making good use of the volume it's got, this 3-passenger bench would be tough for adults over long distances due mainly to the lack of legroom. Pluses include well-shaped, supportive cushions and big windows. But the front cabin is a different story. Open the door and hop into the driver's seat of this outwardly small car, and the amount of sheer volume inside is striking. Seriously, it feels like you just walked into a Walmart. The cartoonishly big windows give great visibility and make the cabin feel open and airy. Everything forward of you is low and square from the dashboard to the hood. The space in here feels like a magic trick, but it's simply thoughtful design and good packaging. Things that most of the cars on sale in the 80s were sorely missing. Speaking of sorely missing from this car's competitors, the ergonomics in here are fantastic. It starts with the driver and passenger seats, which hold up surprisingly well to modern standards and were considered a big advantage for this car in its day. The shape and padding of these seats is excellent for average-size adults, although bigger drivers might find them tight. Glance down and the Accord's instrument cluster pops up from the otherwise low dashboard, unobstructed by the thin 4-spoke steering wheel. If you buy my theory that you can tell a lot about a car from its instrument cluster, then the Accord must be alright. The arrangement of the gauges is classic. Their sizes are appropriate. The font is tasteful. The speedometer doesn't waste space by going up to excessively high speeds and provides good granularity. You can tell from the way the needles swing that all of the moving parts behind the escutcheon are of high quality. To top it off, there are some extra goodies in here that you wouldn't necessarily expect from a modestly priced car. For instance, the mimic of the Accord's body showing which doors are currently open was a novelty in the mid-80s. There are 3 warning indicators which change color to indicate when things like oil changes are due, and they're reset by inserting the ignition key into the corresponding slots below. To top it all off, there's even a lamp test button, which allows you to check and see if any of the incandescent warning bulbs are burnt out. Keeping in character with most Japanese cars from this period, the Accord's controls and switchgear are intuitively laid out, easy to reach, and feel solid. The dashboard places function over form. A kindergartner could get behind the wheel of this car and have the air conditioner and windshield wipers figured out in an instant. One odd exception are the 4 tiny separate buttons for the horn on the steering wheel. I just find them a little bit tiny and high in number. Yes, there is a lot of hard plastic in here, but it's good stuff. Solid feeling with a nice grain and degree of luster. The quality of materials and workmanship are excellent. It's from behind the wheel of this car, even when stationary, that you can start to appreciate the phenomenon that it was in its time. Just sitting in here, everything fits right. Everything feels right. Things like packaging and ergonomics are subjective qualities. They don't necessarily stand out on paper. But what made the Accord famous was its ability to come together as more than the sum of its parts and make such a desirable impression in person. And it only gets better once the car is rolling. The sound of the car starting and the flash of the warning lights on the dash will bring back memories for anyone who was around the popular Hondas of the 80s and 90s. Release the handbrake and it feels like you're in a really solid car, a more expensive one than this. The well-bolstered driver's seat hugs your back, its foam still supportive. As you go down the road, you notice how new the dashboard still looks, even after 35 years in the South. You notice that the car doesn't rattle, it doesn't creak. Nothing is loose. Everything is sound. The fasteners and the adhesives are still holding. The cabin doesn't feel poor or worn out or trashy, the way old cars often do. Everything about the car's body feels thin, and that is a double-edged sword. On one hand, the thin doors, skinny pillars, and tight dimensions give great visibility and maneuverability, and put you in touch with the road and deliver a more raw driving experience than what we've become used to. On the other hand, the isolation of newer cars offers a certain kind of comfort. This car is kind of buzzy inside, and it wouldn't be my first choice to get T-boned by a Yukon in. The steering is tight and crisp, and the big thin-rimmed wheel is a throwback. It tracks dead straight on center with no dead spot, and the ratio is rather quick for snappy low-speed maneuvering. This steering is responsive, and it feels modern. The suspension is the same way. This car feels tossable and light on its feet. The suspension is communicative, but harsh impacts like potholes are mitigated very well. Over normal roads at higher speeds, the car feels steady and composed. It doesn't wallow or jiggle or shake like you might expect an average car from the mid-80s to do. Going down this 4-lane average condition asphalt road at 55 miles per hour, for instance, the Accord feels steady-handed, mature, and expensive. This car was prized in its day for both its ride and its handling and the balance between the two, and I can absolutely see why. The engine's 86 horsepower might not sound like much, but they are 86 of the best horses you could ask for. You also have to remember that curb weights for this car ranged from 2,200 to 2,400 pounds, depending on configuration. There's very little low-end torque, but this engine revs up quickly, smoothly, and eagerly. It's not a fast car, of course, but it feels decidedly unslow, and this engine outclassed most other small engines of its day in terms of refinement. This was proof that a 4-cylinder didn't have to be harsh and unpleasant. In fact, a 4-cylinder front-wheel drive car could be downright fun to drive. I think it would have been really cool if this were a manual car, considering that clutch and shift feel were widely reported to be excellent in typical Honda fashion, and also because 1980s automatics tend to lose a lot of power in the torque converter. However, I was pleased with the operation of this automatic. The shifts were smooth, quick, and crisp, and they were timed late enough to allow the engine to rev up and make good use of its power band. The car's power front disc rear drum brakes exhibit no pulling, and pedal feel is responsive. Responsive. That's the key word for everything about the way this car moves and acts. Responsive. It's the way it feels. It's the way it interacts with its driver. This car came to America when our car market was at an impressionable juncture. American cars were once good mostly for the sake of their excess, their size, their displacement, their power, their big numbers, their volume. But the post-war economy boom eventually wore off and the oil eventually started to run out. Sugar highs never do last. Less than eager to face changing realities head-on, domestic car companies kept doing what they'd always done, producing cars whose selling points were based on a sense of extravagance. But that supposed extravagance was becoming increasingly vapid, hollowed out from within. The cars were ultimately extensions of the organizations building them. Big, uninspired, slow to respond, and ultimately not well equipped to last. This Honda arrived in America and demonstrated to us what other parts of the world had known for a long time. When times get tougher, you scale back. If you can't get the fundamentals right, you scale back. The truth is, this is not one of the greatest cars of all time. It's still at heart a tinny, carbureted economy car from 1984. It's neat, but it doesn't match a newer car for daily drivability. It's small and bare by modern standards. It's noisy and finicky now that it's old. But if you're willing to look at this car through the lens of what it meant in 1984, this was an amazing piece of craftsmanship. These cars were eminently desirable and cast a stark contrast against domestic models of the time. The Accord placed quality before quantity at a time when Americans were used to the reverse, and it did so for the masses. It was that contrast that made cars like this one so meaningful. It was that contrast that made the name Honda what it is today.